In 325 AD, a group of powerful men gathered behind closed doors. They had one mission: to decide which sacred texts humanity would be allowed to read, and which ones would be erased forever. But there was a problem. One specific manuscript couldn't simply be burned. It was too dangerous to exist, but destroying it completely was impossible. Copies had already spread. Monks had already memorized it. The solution? Bury it. Not in the ground, but in silence. This book was never destroyed. It was hidden. Not because it was false, but because it was too true to be read. And to this day, the Vatican knows exactly where it is. What you're about to discover in the next few minutes might completely change the way you see the history of faith. Throughout all of human history, ideas have always been more dangerous than armies. Kings didn't fear enemy soldiers as much as they feared philosophers. Empires didn't fall to invasions. They crumbled because of thoughts that spread like wildfire among the people. And religious institutions? They learned early on that the greatest enemy wasn't the sword. It was the scroll. Many texts were banned over the centuries, burned in public squares in front of terrified crowds, erased from official records as if they never existed. Entire libraries were reduced to ashes, but there were writings that couldn't simply be eliminated. They were too well known, too widely copied, too deeply loved. The only solution was to silence them. The text we're talking about emerged in the first centuries of Christianity, a turbulent, chaotic period when the faith was still taking shape. The doctrines that seem absolute today simply didn't exist. There was no single official version of the story. There was no consensus on who Jesus really was, what he taught, or who had the authority to speak in his name. It was a time of intense disputes. Different Christian groups defended radically different interpretations. Some believed Jesus was entirely divine, others entirely human. Some argued that salvation came through faith, others through direct knowledge. And in the middle of this war of ideas, texts circulated freely, each one offering its own version of the truth. This particular manuscript was written in that context. Its language was solemn, symbolic, carefully crafted. It seemed authentic. It seemed ancient. It seemed sacred. At first glance, it could easily be mistaken for any other text that would later become part of the official Bible. But there was something different about it. What disturbed the early church leaders wasn't the manuscript's age. It wasn't its obscure origin. It was what it said. The text presented an alternative version of events considered unquestionable. Central figures of the faith appeared in a completely different light. More human, more relatable, less distant and untouchable. Entire passages reinterpreted sacred moments in ways that directly contradicted the narrative that was beginning to be made official. And worst of all, the text didn't attack spirituality. On the contrary, it celebrated it. But it questioned something far more dangerous. It questioned who had the right to interpret it. You need to understand the context. As Christianity grew, transforming from a persecuted sect into the official religion of the Roman Empire, the need for unity became vital. And unity back then meant one thing: control. Control required a single version of the truth, a single interpretation of sacred texts, a single authority capable of declaring what was correct and what was heresy. There was no room for ambiguity, no tolerance for parallel interpretations, and certainly no permission for texts that suggested something revolutionary, that access to the divine could be direct, personal, and completely independent of any religious authority. This manuscript claimed exactly that. And that idea was unacceptable. Historical records that survived show that religious leaders classified the text as dangerous to the faith of the simple. Notice the choice of words. They didn't say it was false. They didn't say it was lies. They said it was dangerous. And dangerous why? Because it didn't destroy belief in God. It destroyed something far more fragile: the belief that you need intermediaries to reach the divine. If this text became widely known, millions of believers would start asking a devastating question. If this was hidden from us, what else were we never told? The church's response was immediate and brutal. The text was officially condemned in ecclesiastical councils. All copies found were to be surrendered to the authorities and burned. Possessing the manuscript became a crime. In some periods, a crime punishable by death. Monks were interrogated, libraries were raided, entire communities were accused of heresy simply for having knowledge of its contents. The message was clear: this text should not exist. But history proves that not everyone obeyed. In remote caves, in isolated monasteries, in secret vaults of families who passed manuscripts down through generations, copies survived. Some monks believed the content was too sacred to disappear. Some scholars believed that truth, whatever it was, deserved to be preserved. And some simply refused to let powerful men decide what they could or couldn't read. Evidence suggests the text was eventually gathered and stored in extremely restricted locations. Not in just any library, but in sealed archives, inaccessible to the public, known only to a tiny circle of people. It wasn't destroyed. It was buried. Not to be forgotten, but to be controlled. Because whoever controls information controls truth. But what exactly does this text say that's so disturbing? It presents spiritual figures in a radically different way, less like distant, all-powerful beings, more like teachers, guides, companions on the journey. Sacred events are retold with details that humanize the characters, showing doubts, conflicts, difficult choices. And there are passages that go even further. Passages that suggest blind obedience was never the original goal of faith. That the true spiritual path wasn't about following orders without questioning, but about developing awareness, seeking understanding, asking questions. The text doesn't destroy belief in something greater. It dismantles the hierarchy built around that belief. And that's far more dangerous. Think about it. If people start believing they don't need intermediaries to connect with the divine, what happens to the entire power structure built on that intermediation? What happens to the institutions, the hierarchies, the fortunes accumulated in the name of faith? Everything begins to crumble. That's why this text was never publicly debated. Its danger doesn't lie in the lies it tells, but in the questions it awakens. As centuries passed, rumors about the manuscript continued to circulate. Historians whispered about its existence. Researchers tried to trace its whereabouts. Some claim it's still kept today in the Vatican secret archives, one of the most protected and least accessible collections on the planet. Miles of shelves containing documents that most of humanity will never see. Others believe copies escaped and ended up in the hands of private collectors, people who understand that the true value of this document isn't in the parchment, but in what it represents. One thing, however, is consensus among scholars. The text was not destroyed. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of this whole story. Even after 17 centuries of silence, it still exists. It's still guarded. It still represents a threat significant enough to be kept away from public eyes. The simple fact that it remains hidden already reveals the power it carries. The most dangerous books in history were never the ones that lied blatantly. Lies can be refuted, they can be exposed, they can be forgotten. The truly dangerous books are the ones that force us to rethink everything we learned, everything we accepted without questioning, everything we were told was absolute truth. They don't impose answers, they awaken doubts. And for certain institutions, doubts are more devastating than any enemy. That's why this text was never meant to be read by the public. Not because it would destroy faith, but because it would return the power of interpretation to the people. And that has always been the greatest threat. History is full of truths they tried to erase, secrets that should have been forgotten, but refused to die. If you want to keep discovering what's been hidden from you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because some secrets only stay powerful while they remain in the darkness. And we're here to turn on the light.